Hello, and welcome to my History 111 digital project. Today I will be talking about Mongol horse archers and why they're significant today, why they're significant in the Mongol Empire. So the purpose of this PowerPoint will be to really just discuss how archery began, to discuss the development and beginning of it, and how it wasn't just used in combat, but it was also used for many years before that. We'll also be talking about the significance of it in livestock and hunting, how horse archers were super important for trading, and not so much the different types of bows because they didn't really have a whole lot of diversity in their bows. They were very small and slender, and we'll go into that and what their main bows have and just the importance of why they were built that way. And a little bit more of an in-depth first look into the battlefield just to see the role and expansion, how they ended up in politics, and overall just why the Mongol archers are significant today and what role they played in the development of the empire. So how it began. First it began in Central and Western Asia, just above China, just north of China, and it was never necessarily in one location since these Mongols were known for being nomadic. There was a lot of settling around the Silk Road during their seasons when they would migrate more eastern and southern due to these long winters that they faced. They were in very mountainous terrain, so that was never very good during the hotter seasons. And these Mongol horsemen played a huge role in the trade because they could transport goods quickly on horseback, and they could also migrate themselves very quickly in the case of a threat. So these horse archers were basically the main breadwinners of the Mongol Empire at this point because they'd trade the livestock and the hunted goods in exchange for Silk Road luxuries that India produced along the Silk Road. And China also gave them tea and art, and this is evidenced by the archaeologists that found artwork and tea leaves in Mongolia. This argument could also be made that it was just influence, and these Mongols brought the influence from the Silk Road across the border. So a little bit about the livestock and hunting. Obviously they domesticated horses, but would also use camels for transport. They obviously wouldn't use the camels for archery, but these horse archers were significant in the trade because they'd be the hunters. Agriculture was very limited in this society at this time, so they'd never really settle or raise animals, but they used sheep and goat occasionally, and this was great because this would be good sources of dairy and protein. And as you can see from these images here of these Mongol soldiers, these Mongol horsemen, they're very big, they're very large, which is impacting their looks to the opposers in the battlefield. And also on horseback you can see they're wearing wool and fur that they obtained from raising these goats and sheep. And this was important to understanding just the looks of the soldiers, as you can see from the image, just well insulated and the domesticated animals, and because they had access to these protein-rich food sources, they were able to become the size they are. So a little bit about the bow composition and the types. They used laminated wood in their bows for the actual bow, which protected them from water damage. And as you can see, there's a horn also used on the arrows. Just the arrows for puncture wounds from long distance, and the tips of the bow heads for short range effectiveness. They're not too big to carry, as you can see, so as not to obstruct the view of the soldiers and not to weigh down the horses. And these big bows would make horse archery way more challenging because archery and horseback riding in themselves are very difficult tasks. So measures had to be ensured that these horse archers could fight with them and practice both skills at once. And as you can see, the drawstring is also very light. It wasn't breakable, however, because of the thinness and the amount of knots that these Mongol soldiers also did for their bowstrings. And because these strings were very lightweight and they were very thin, it did cause a lot of burns and scars along the Mongols' hands for holding them back for so long. So it was common to see a lot of Mongols with bandaged hands and gloves. So a little bit about the role of archery in their combat. So the speed and mobility of the horseback enabled them to cover very long distances in a very short period of time. In fact, the entire Mongol Empire managed to expand 25 years further than any other empire had prior to them. And in this expansion, In actual battle, their speed was unmatched. Their strategy was just essentially to run their opposers with horse archers in an all-out siege from all directions. And the speed enabled them to essentially not only catch the enemy off guard, but also get word around to each other about what they were up against from the opposing team. This enabled their soldiers to gain an acute sense of adaptability in the case that they were up against things that they were unfamiliar with, like castles or cannons, soldiers in unfamiliar terrain. And the Mongols obviously had a lot of experience with unfamiliar terrain because they lived in mountainous regions and it was already exposed to them, so they didn't really have to adapt to much as far as the terrain was concerned, so they were able to navigate pretty quick. So a little bit about the role and expansion. Because of just how quickly and how much land these horse archers helped to obtain, even after Genghis Khan had acquired the land for the Mongols, he had the good sense to place people in charge based on skill and merit and trust, rather than just by blood and inheritance, and this caused a lot of experienced cavalry soldiers to be placed in charge of these newly acquired khanates, and they essentially ran with fear and the use of propaganda to tell everyone to surrender and join, so that those who weren't slaughtered and massacred by these massive raids from the Mongol soldiers and Mongol horsemen, they would essentially join the Mongols, and if they had any skills that were deemed useful, they would help to expand the empire, whether it was agricultural or political, and this allowed them to expand way further, and it really allowed cooperation from all these other nations. So a little bit about Genghis Khan's legacy is what makes this significant, because it's often asked, why were the Mongolian horse archers significant today? Well, because up until now, battles had mostly been fought and won with marching troops and hand-on-hand combat. And sure, archery was seen, but it was never, they'd be set up really far away and not really as up close and right on the main front lines of the battlefield. Plus, they were mainly used for support in battle rather than just being the main soldiers, and this goes with the same with the horses and domestication. Although they had been used before, they didn't quite have the same effect as in accordance with the long-distance firepower. And Genghis Khan's legacy, sure, he's known for leading this massive land siege and slaughterfest across the Asian continent, but it was the horse archers he sent into battle that allowed him to move so quickly and allowed the empire to expand the way that it did. And for their political structure, it can kind of go both ways. In one way, it was good that the archers were in charge to keep the entire empire in check, but in others, it wasn't, because as history has often shown, as from the dictators in Rome, from Nero and Julius Caesar, and also in cruel monarchs seen and from like pharaohs in Egypt and Persia and Mesopotamia, and even in recent examples that can date back to the American Revolution and the Red Scare, leading by fear isn't necessarily the best approach, because it's always going to end up leading to rebellion. In many ways, these Mongol horse archers pioneered combat today, because sure, you don't see soldiers riding horses and fighting with bows and arrows anymore, but the same sense of speed and mobility in the same way these archers were used, can be found in modern military transport, and this can be seen in like trucks and tanks rather than using just these horses and archers. And instead of archers, you'll have a lot of guns and bigger guns. A little bit of animations here. And then for the works cited page, some really good material. Find John Green on Crash Course to be very interesting. Also good stuff on Gale and Encyclopedia Britannica. Yeah, and thanks for watching. That's all I have. Why the Mongol horse archers are significant today.